Hello, this is the History and Mythology channel, and our current video is dedicated to the long and dramatic history of Georgia. This Caucasian country has been in the news for the ongoing protests there over the government's decision to once again delay negotiations on its accession to the European Union. In August 2008, Georgia tried to walk the path to the European Union. Although highly conservative, Georgians had begun to move closer to the two Western blocs, the EU and NATO. Then the Russian military invasion of South Ossetia stopped the westernization of the former Soviet Republic. Europe and NATO did nothing. 6 years later, the same thing happened in the much larger and closer Ukraine. The country was on the verge of joining the European Union when first a failed pro-Russian coup attempt and then a Russian invasion of the Crimea and Donbas regions stopped its western course. In a sense, Georgia was a rehearsal for Ukraine. The story of 2022 and the beginning of the full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war continues to unfold before our eyes. But let's return to Georgia with its analogous fate. Georgia is interesting for several historical and cultural reasons. First, the country is probably the true homeland of wine, just as Bulgaria is the true homeland of gold processing. Ancient cultures on both sides of the Black Sea have been in trade exchange since a very early historical period. Secondly, Georgia has been an Orthodox country for centuries without being either Greek or Slavic speaking. Unlike its neighbor Armenia, Georgia follows the Chalcedonian version of the Eastern Orthodox faith, and similarly to Armenia, Georgia has its own national alphabet originally intended for recording Christian texts. Unlike the case of Georgia and Armenia, the Bulgarian national Christian script, the Cyrillic alphabet, has become international and is used even far beyond national borders. Thirdly, Georgia is in the unique position of being a part of the Byzantine sphere of cultural influence, but at the same time being the homeland of phenomena that are usually assumed to be purely Western, namely chivalry and courtly culture. Finally, one of the ancient names of Georgia is Iberia, a word that strangely reminds us of the Iberian Peninsula in the extreme west of Europe. Another similar name connecting the extreme east and west of the old continent is Albania, again one of the names of a part of Georgia, of the Balkan country we know, as well as of a part of Britain. As you can see, Georgia, Sakartvelo, or the land of Saint George, is an infinitely interesting topic, indirectly related to the history of the many surrounding cultures. The region of Caucasia lies between two continents at the junction of several ancient and historic trade routes, which endow it with a significant strategic and economic importance. Caucasia is also situated between two seas, the Black Sea, including the Sea of Azov, and the Caspian. Into these seas flow the waters of some of the mightiest rivers in Europe, the Danube, the Dniester, the Dnieper, the Don, and the Volga. From the east and north, through Kazakhstan, the river Ural empties into the Caspian Sea. From the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov in the west, the imposing mountains of the Caucasus Range stretch some 1100 kilometers eastwards to the Caspian Sea, only broken throughout their length by narrow passages and defiles which are dominated by high peaks. On an east-west axis, Caucasia assumes the role of a large stepping stone between the Black Sea and the Caspian, providing links with Europe and Asia. Across the Black Sea, the Caucasus is linked with the climatic warmth of the Mediterranean world. The Caspian littoral provides numerous start points for Central Asia with the trade routes to Turkestan, India and China. Correspondingly, on a north-south axis, it forms a land passage between the Russian and Ukrainian lands and the Muslim countries of Iran and Turkey. Both climatically and geographically, Caucasia is a land of abrupt and dramatic contrasts. In the west, snow-capped mountains and alpine pastures overlook the Black Sea with its subtropical and luxuriant shoreline. In the Rioni Delta area of western Georgia, swamps had to be drained. In eastern Georgia, arid areas of steppe have to be irrigated to support the growing of crops. The Republic of Georgia is very much the central part of the Caucasus region. Consequently, Georgia must be viewed against that background, and in particular in the context of the wider and extremely complicated ethnic and linguistic composition of the region as a whole. The multifaceted ethnological face of Caucasia, with its numerous nationalities and races, came into being over a wide span of centuries. The Caucasus, in its high mountain fastness, provided a natural refuge for peoples moving south from the Eurasian plain or northwards from Asia Minor. Remnants of nations could live undisturbed within the security of the mountains over centuries. Immigrant tribes became entangled and intermingled with the original inhabitants so that racial origins became totally obscured. The Caucasus was situated at the focal point of Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures. Great ancient empires like the Sumerians, the Hittites, the Babylonians and the Assyrians entered Caucasia. The kingdom of Urartu included many trans-Caucasian peoples within its borders. The civilizations of Troy and the Aegean, Greece and Rome impacted from the west. Persians and Parthians also held sway in the Caucasus. Hence, the Caucasus, even before the arrival of the Arabs, the Seljuk Turks, the Byzantines and the Mongol Tatars, became a living museum of ancient races and a living repository of languages, creeds and cultures. The Arabic language, with its own picturesque way of describing nouns, for instance, a shark, Tib al-Bakr, is literally wolf of the sea, or a helicopter assumes the name of father of the locusts, summarizes the Caucasus as the mountain of languages. Ethnic preservation remains a strong force among the peoples of the Caucasus. Additionally, strong individualism, a spirit of independence and a deep hostility to all forms of regimentation are other pronounced characteristics of these peoples. However, in the past, this spirit of individualism has proved to be a major hindrance to the formation of any united form of Pan-Caucasian federation. Classical and Late Antiquity. The ancient Greeks knew of the pre-Georgian kingdom of Caucasus in Caucasus by the eastern coast of the Black Sea, and it featured in the Greek legend of Jason and the Argonauts, who traveled there in search of the Golden Fleece. Starting around 2000 BC, northwestern Caucasus was inhabited by the Svan and Dzan peoples of the Kartvelian tribes. Another important ethnic element of ancient Caucasus were Greeks, who between 1000 and 550 BC established many trading colonies in the coastal area, among them Nessus, Pitius, Dioscurias or modern Sukhumi, Genos, Phasis or modern Poti, Apsaros and Rizos, modern Rize in Turkey. In the eastern part of Georgia there was a struggle for the leadership among the various Georgian confederations during the 6th to 4th centuries BC, which was finally won by the Kartlian tribes from the region of Mtskheta. According to Georgian tradition, the kingdom of Kartli, known as Iberia in the Greco-Roman literature, was founded around 300 BC by Parnavas I, the first ruler of the Parnavasid dynasty. Between 653 and 333 BC, both Caucasus and Iberia survived successive invasions by the Iranian Median Empire. The case is slightly different for the Achaemenid Iranian-Persian Empire, however. According to Greek historian Herodotus, Achaemenid power extended as far as the Caucasus Mountains, but Colchians are not included in his list of the 20 Persian provinces, or satrapies, nor are they referred to in the lists of Achaemenid lands, the so-called Dahyava, given in the Old Persian inscriptions of Persian king Darius and his successors. In Xenophon's Anabasis, the tribes of Colchis in East Pontus are referred to as independent. On the other hand, Herodotus mentioned both the Colchians and various Pontic tribes in his catalogue of approximately 57 peoples who participated in Persian king Xerxes' expedition against Greece in 481 BC. It is thus probable that the Achaemenids never succeeded in asserting effective rule over Colchis, though local tribal leaders seem to have acknowledged some kind of Persian suzerainty. The Encyclopedia Iranica further states, whereas the adjoining Pontic tribes of the 19th satrapy and the Armenians of the 13th satrapy of Persia are mentioned as having paid tribute to Persia, but the Colchians and their Caucasian neighbors are not. They had, however, undertaken to send some gifts every 5 years, maybe another lighter form of a tax. At the end of the 4th century BC, southern Iberia witnessed the invading armies of Alexander the Great, who established a vast Greco-Macedonian empire to the south of the Caucasus. Neither Iberia nor Colchis were incorporated into the empire of Alexander or any of the successive Hellenistic states of the Middle East. However, the culture of ancient Greece still had a considerable influence on the region, and Greek was widely spoken in the cities of Colchis. In Iberia, Greek influence was less noticeable and Aramaic was widely spoken. Between the early 2nd century BC and the late 2nd century AD, both Colchis and Iberia, together with the neighboring countries, became an arena of long and devastating conflicts between major and local powers such as Rome, Armenia, and the short-lived Kingdom of Pontus. Roman general Pompey's campaign in 66 to 65 BC annexed Armenia and then headed north along the Kura River and then west down the Rioni River to the Black Sea. In 189 BC, the rapidly growing Kingdom of Armenia took over more than half of Iberia, conquering the southern and southwestern provinces of Gogarene, Taochia and Heniochia, as well as some other territories. Between 120 and 63 BC, Armenia's ally Mithridat VI Eupator of Pontus conquered all of Colchis and incorporated it into his kingdom, embracing almost all of Asia Minor as well as the eastern and northern Black Sea coastal areas. This close association with Armenia brought upon the country an invasion in 65 BC by Roman armies, commanded by Pompey, who was then at war with Mithridates of Pontus and Armenia. Still, Rome did not establish permanent power over Iberia. 29 years later, in 36 BC, the Romans again marched on Iberia, forcing King Barnabas II to join their campaign against Caucasian Albania. The former kingdom of Colchis became the Roman province of Lazicum, ruled by Roman legati. Struggles between Rome and neighboring Persia marked the following 600 years of Georgian history. While the Georgian kingdom of Colchis was administered as a Roman province, Caucasian Iberia freely accepted the Roman imperial protection. A stone inscription discovered at Mtskheta speaks of the 1st century ruler Mithridat I as the friend of the Caesars and the king of the Roman-loving Iberians. Emperor Vespasianus fortified the ancient Mtskheta site of Armazi for the Iberian kings in 75 AD. In the 2nd century AD, Iberia strengthened her position in the area, especially during the reign of King Pharasman II, who achieved full independence from Rome and reconquered some of the previously lost territories from declining Armenia. In the early 3rd century, Rome had to give up Albania and most of Armenia to Sassanid Persia. The province of Lazicum was given a degree of autonomy that by the end of the century developed into full independence, with the formation of a new kingdom of Lazica Egrisi on the territories of smaller principalities of the Dzans, Svans, Apsuls and Sangings. This new Western Georgian state survived more than 250 years until the year 562, when it was absorbed by the late Roman or Byzantine Empire. In the 3rd century AD, the Lazi tribe came to dominate most of Colchis, establishing the kingdom of Lazica, locally known as Egrisi. Colchis was a scene of the protracted rivalry between the Eastern Roman and the Sassanid or Persian Empire, culminating in the Lazic War from 542 to 562. Christianity. Before formal Christianization, the cult of Mithras and Zoroastrianism were commonly practiced in Iberia from the 1st century. The cult of Mithras, distinguished by its syncretic character and thus complementary to local cults, especially the cult of the sun god, gradually came to merge with ancient Georgian beliefs. The Eastern Georgian kingdom of Iberia became one of the first states in the world to convert to Christianity in 327. When the king of Iberia, Miriam III, established it as the official state religion. However, the date varies based on numerous accounts and historical documents which indicate Iberia adopting Christianity as a state religion in 317, 324, 330, etc., etc. According to the Georgian chronicles, Saint Nino of Cappadocia converted Georgia to Christianity in 330 during the time of Constantine the Great. By the middle of the 4th century, though, both Lazica, formerly the kingdom of Colchis, and Iberia adopted Christianity as their formal religion. This adoption of Christianity tied the kingdom to the Byzantine Empire, which exerted strong cultural influence over it. However, after the Emperor Julian, the apostate, was slain during his failed campaign in Persia in 363, Rome ceded control of Iberia to Persia, and King Asfagur, became a Persian vassal, an outcome confirmed by the Peace of Achillisense in 387. However, a later rule of Kartli, Pharasman IV, preserved his country's autonomy and ceased to pay tribute to Persia. Persia prevailed, and Sasanian kings began to appoint a viceroy to keep watch on their vassal. They eventually made the office hereditary in the ruling house of Lower Kartli, thus inaugurating the Kartli Pitixtiate, which brought an extensive territory under its control. Although it remained a part of the kingdom of Kartli, its viceroys turned their domain into a center of Persian influence. Sasanian rulers put Christianity of the Georgians to a severe test. They promoted the teachings of Zoroaster, and by the middle of the 5th century, Zoroastrianism had become a second formal religion in eastern Georgia alongside Christianity. During the 4th and most of the 5th centuries, Iberia, known also as the Kingdom of Kartli, was under Persian control. At the end of the 5th century, though, Prince Vakhtang I Gorgasali orchestrated an anti-Persian uprising and restored Iberian statehood, proclaiming himself an independent king. After this, the armies of Vakhtang launched several campaigns against both Persia and the Byzantine Empire, but his struggle for the independence and unity of the Georgian state did not have lasting success. After Vakhtang's death in 502 and the short reign of his son Daci, Iberia was reincorporated into Persia and ruled by a marspan, that is, a governor, who in Georgian was called Erism Tavari. The Iberian nobility were granted the privilege of electing the governors. Georgian nobles urged the Byzantine Emperor Maurice to revive the Kingdom of Iberia in 582, but in 591, Byzantium and Persia decisively agreed to divide Iberia between them, with Tbilisi to be in Persian hands and Mtsheta to be under Byzantine control. Georgia had been effectively divided in a Byzantine and Sassanid sphere of influence, with wars raging between the two eastern superpowers. Local dynasts followed the fates of victory and pledged their loyalty to the emperors of Constantinople or the Shahanshah in Ctesiphon, respectively. Middle Ages and the Golden Age of Georgia. By AD 636, a new power emerged in the east, the Arabs. Then by the late 7th century, the Byzantine-Persian rivalry had given way to Arab conquest of the region. Georgia fell under Arab influence as Persia crumbled and the Byzantines retreated to the west. In the struggle against the Arab occupation, the Bagrationi dynasty came to rule over Tao Klarjeti and established the Kurupalatate of Iberia as a nominal dependency under the Byzantine Empire. The restoration of the Georgian kingship begins in AD 888, when Adarnase IV took the title of King of the Iberians. However, the Bagrationi dynasty failed to maintain the integrity of their kingdom, which was actually divided between the three branches of the family, with the main branch retaining Tao and another controlling Klarjeti. At the end of the 10th century, the Kurupalat David of Tao invaded the earldom of Iberia or Kartli and gave it to his foster son Bagrat III and installed Gurgen as his regent, who was later crowned as King of Kings of the Iberians on the death of Bagrat the Simple in 994. Through his fortunate bloodlines, Bagrat was destined to sit upon two thrones. Furthermore, through his mother Guranduht, sister of the childless Abkhazian king Theodosius III, Bagrat was a potential heir to the realm of Abkhazia. 3 years later, after the death of Theodosius III, Bagrat III inherited the Abkhazian throne. In the year 1008, Gurgen died, and Bagrat succeeded him as king of the Iberians, becoming thus the first king of a unified realm of Abkhazia and Iberia. After he had secured his patrimony, Bagrat proceeded to press a claim to the easternmost Georgian kingdom of Kakheti-Hereti and annexed it in or around 1010, after 2 years of fighting and aggressive diplomacy. Bagrat's reign, a period of uttermost importance in the history of Georgia, brought about the final victory of the Georgian Bagratids in the centuries-long power struggles. Anxious to create more stable and centralized monarchy, Bagrat eliminated or at least diminished the autonomy of the dynastic princes. In his eyes, the most possible internal danger came from the Klarjeti line of the Bagrationi. Although seeming to have acknowledged Bagrat's authority, they continued to be styled as kings and sovereigns of Klarjeti. To secure the succession to his son, George I, Bagrat lured his cousins on protective reconciliatory meeting to the Panatskerti castle and threw them in prison in 1010. Bagrat's foreign policy was generally peaceful, and the king successfully maneuvered to avoid the conflicts with both the Byzantine and Muslim neighbors, even though David's domains of Tao remained in a Byzantine and Tbilisi in the Arab hands. The major political and military event during George I's reign, a war against the Byzantine Empire, had its roots back to the 1900s, when the Georgian prince Kurupalat David of Tao, following his abortive rebellion against Emperor Basil II, had to agree to cede his extensive possessions in Tao and the neighboring lands to the emperor on his deathbed. All the efforts by David's stepson and George's father, Bagrat III, to prevent these territories from being annexed to the empire went in vain. Young and ambitious, George launched a campaign to restore the Kurupalates' succession to Georgia and occupied Tao in 1015-1016. The Byzantines were at that time involved in a relentless war with the Bulgarian Empire, limiting their actions to the west. But as soon as Bulgaria was conquered, Basil II led his army against Georgia in 1021. An exhausting war lasted for 2 years and ended in a decisive Byzantine victory, forcing George to agree to a peace treaty in which he had not only to abandon his claims to Tao, but to surrender several of his southwestern possessions to Basil and to give his 3-year-old son Bagrat IV as a hostage. The young child Bagrat IV spent the next 3 years in the imperial capital of Constantinople and was released in 1025. After George I's death in 1027, Bagrat, aged 8, succeeded to the throne. By the time Bagrat IV became king, the Bagratids' drive to complete the unification of all Georgian lands had gained irreversible momentum. The kings of Georgia settled Kutaisi in western Georgia, from which they ran all of what had been the kingdom of Abkhazia and a greater portion of Iberia. Tao had been lost to the Byzantines while a Muslim emir remained in Tbilisi, and the kings of Kakheti-Hereti obstinately defended their autonomy in easternmost Georgia. Furthermore, the loyalty of great nobles to the Georgian crown was far from stable. During Bagrat's minority, the regency had advanced the positions of the high nobility, whose influence he subsequently tried to limit when he assumed full royal powers. Simultaneously, the Georgian crown was confronted with 2 formidable external foes, the Byzantine Empire and the resurgent Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk threat prompted the Georgian and Byzantine governments to seek a closer cooperation. To secure the alliance, Bagrat's daughter Marta, or maybe Maria, married at some point between 1066 and 1071 the Byzantine co-emperor Michael VII Dukas. The Great Seljuk Invasion. The second half of the 11th century was marked by the strategically significant invasion of the Seljuk Turks, who by the end of the 1040s had succeeded in building a vast empire, including most of Central Asia and Persia. The Seljuks made their first appearances in Georgia in the 1060s, when the Sultan Alp Arslan I laid waste to the southwestern provinces of the Georgian kingdom and reduced Kakheti. These intruders were part of the same wave of the Turkish movement which inflicted a crushing defeat on the Byzantine army at Malazgirt in 1071. Although the Georgians were able to recover from Alp Arslan's invasion by securing the Tao, or the Team of Iberia, a frontier region which had been a bone of contention between Georgia and the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine withdrawal from Anatolia brought them in more direct contact with the Seljuks. Following the 1073 devastation of Kartli by the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan, George II successfully repelled an invasion. In 1076, the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah I surged into Georgia and reduced many settlements to ruins. Harassed by the massive Turkic influx, known in Georgian history as the Great Turkish Invasion, from 1079 to 1080 onward, George was pressured into submitting to Malik Shah to ensure a precious degree of peace at the price of an annual tribute. King David IV and Georgian Reconquista. The struggle against the Seljuk invaders in Georgia was led by the young King David IV of the Bagrationi royal family, who inherited the throne in 1089 at the age of 16 after the abdication of his father George II. Soon after coming to power, David created the regular army and peasant militia in order to be able to resist Seljuk colonization of his country. The First Crusade and the Crusaders' offensive against the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia and Syria favored David's successful campaigns in Georgia. By the end of 1099, David had stopped paying tribute to the Seljuks and had liberated most of the Georgian lands, with the exception of Tbilisi and Hereti. In 1103, he reorganized the Georgian Orthodox Church and closely linked it with the state by appointing as Catholicos, or Archbishop, a Crown Chancellor. In 1103-1105, the Georgian army took over Hereti and made successful raids into still Seljuk-controlled Shirvan. Between 1110 and 1118, David took Lori, Samshvilde, Rustavi and other fortresses of Lower Kartli and Tashiri, thus turning Tbilisi into an isolated Seljuk enclave. In 1118-1119, having considerable amounts of free unsettled land as a result of the withdrawal of Turkish nomads, and desperately needing qualified manpower for the army, King David invited some 40,000 Kipchak warriors from North Caucasus to settle in Georgia with their families. In 1120, the ruler of Alania recognized himself as King David's vassal and afterwards sent thousands of Alans to cross the main Caucasus range into Georgia, where they settled in Kartli. The Georgian royal army also welcomed mercenaries from Germany, Italy and Scandinavia. All those Westerners were defined in Georgia as the Franks, as well as from Kievan Rus. In 1121, the Seljuk Sultan Mahmud declared jihad on Georgia and sent a strong army under one of his famous commanders, Ilgazi, to fight the Georgians. Although significantly outnumbered by the Turks, the Georgians managed to defeat the invaders at the Battle of Digdori, and in 1122 they took over Tbilisi, making it Georgia's capital. 3 years later, the Georgians conquered Shirvan. As a result, the mostly Christian-populated Gishikabala area in western Shirvan, a relic of the once prosperous Albanian kingdom, was annexed by Georgia, while the rest of already Islamicized Shirvan became Georgia's client state. In the same year, a large portion of Armenia was liberated by David's troops and fell into Georgian hands as well. Thus in 1124, David also became the king of Armenians, incorporating northern Armenia into the lands of the Georgian crown. In 1125, King David died, leaving Georgia with the status of a strong regional power. In Georgia, he is called the Builder. David the Builder's successors, Kings Demetrius I, David V and George III, continued the policy of Georgia's expansion by subordinating most of the mountain clans and tribes of North Caucasus and further securing Georgian positions in Shirvan. However, the most glorious sovereign of Georgia of that period was Queen Tamar, David's great-granddaughter. The kingdom continued to flourish under Demetrius I, the son of David. As soon as he ascended to the throne, the neighboring Muslim rulers began attacking Georgia from all sides. The Seljukid sultans fought to restore the rule of the Shirvan Shahs. Shirvan's large Muslim population rose against Georgia. This probably happened in 1129 or 1130, when Demetrius restored the Shirvan Shah to power in Shirvan, installing on the throne Manuchir II, the husband of his daughter Rusudan. The Shirvan Shah had to provide the Georgian king with troops whenever the latter demanded that. In 1130, Georgia was attacked by the Sultan of Ahlat, Shaharmen Sukmen II. This war was started by the passage of Ani into the hands of the Georgians. Demetrius I had to compromise and give up Ani to the Shahadid emir Fadl ibn Mahmud on terms of vassalage and inviolability of the Christian churches. In 1139, Demetrius raided the city of Ganja in Aran. He brought the iron gate of the defeated city to Georgia and donated it to the Gelati monastery at Kutaisi. Despite this brilliant victory, Demetrius could hold Ganja only for a few years. In reply to this, the Sultan of the Elguzids attacked Ganja several times, and in 1143 the town once more fell to the Sultan. According to the Mihitar Ghosh, Demetrius ultimately gained possession of Ganja, but when he gave his daughter in marriage to the Sultan, he presented the latter with the town as dowry, and the Sultan appointed his own emir to rule it. Thus Ganja once again fell into the hands of the Elguzids. In 1130, Demetrius revealed a plot of nobles, probably involving the king's half-brother Vakhtang. The king arrested the conspirators and executed one of their leaders in 1138 or 1145. Fadl's successor, Fakhreddin Shaddad, Al-Shaddadid Emir of Ani, asked for Selçuk's daughter's hand. However, Selçuk refused him. This caused a deep hatred in Shaddad towards Selçuk. In 1145, although his reign saw a disruptive family conflict related to royal succession, Georgia remained a centralized power with a strong military. A talented poet, Demetrius also continued his father's contributions to Georgia's religious polyphony. The most famous of his hymns is "Thou art a vineyard," dedicated to God. King Demetrius was succeeded by his son George III in 1156, beginning a stage of more offensive foreign policy. In the same year of his ascension to the throne, George launched a successful campaign against the Shah Armens, raided their lands and turned back with prisoners and booty. In 1161, George III took over Ani and appointed his general Ivane Urbeli as its ruler. A coalition consisting of the ruler of Ahlat, Shah Armen Sükmen II, the ruler of Diyarbakir, Qutbuddin Ilghazi, Al-Malik of Erzurum and others was formed as soon as the Georgians seized the town, but the latter defeated the allies. In the summer, the Georgian army, whose number reached 30,000 men, took Dvin. In response to this, Eldigus soon proceeded northward to recover the city of Dvin. A coalition of Muslim rulers, Shah Armen Saifeddin Beytemir, Ahmadili Arslanaba, Arzenemir Fakhreddin and Selçuk II, led by Eldigus, took the fortress of Gagi, laid waste as far as the region of Gagi and Gergangunik, seized prisoners and booty, and then moved to Ani, capturing and granting it to Shahadid Emir Shahanshah ibn Mahmud. The Muslim rulers were jubilant, and they prepared for a new campaign. However, this time they were forced out by George III, who marched into Aran at the beginning of 1166, occupied a region extending to Ganja, devastated the land and turned back with prisoners and booty. The Shaddadid ruled Ani for about 10 years as vassals of Elgis, but in 1174 George III took the Shahanshah as a prisoner and occupied Ani once again, appointing Ivane Urbeli as governor. After that, Eldigus, together with other Muslim rulers, invaded Georgia twice. The first invasion was successfully repelled by the Georgians, but during the second invasion, the Georgians lost Ani, and in 1175 it was recaptured by the Shaddadids. Queen Tamar the Great and the Golden Age of Georgia. The reign of Queen Tamar represented the peak of Georgia's might in the whole history of the nation. In 1204, Tamar's armies crushed new Turkish invasions from the southeast and south and launched several successful campaigns into Turkish-controlled southern Armenia. As a result, most of southern Armenia, including the cities of Karin, Erzincan, Helat, Mush and Van, came under Georgian control. Although it was not included in the lands of the Georgian crown and was left under the nominal rule of local Turkish emirs and sultans, southern Armenia became a protectorate of the Kingdom of Georgia. The temporary fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1204 to the Crusaders left Georgia and the Second Bulgarian Empire as the strongest Christian states in the whole eastern Mediterranean area. The same year, Queen Tamar sent her troops to take over the former Byzantine Lazona and Piriadria, with the cities of Atina, Riza, Trebizond, Kherson, Amisos, Kotiora, Heraclea and Sinope. In 1205, the occupied territory was transformed into the Kingdom of Trebizond, which was dependent on Georgia. Tamar's relative Prince Alexios Komnenos was crowned as King or even Emperor of Trebizond. In the immediate years after, the Georgian armies invaded northern Persia, modern-day Iranian Azerbaijan, and took the cities of Marand, Tabriz, Ardabil, Zanjan, Khoi, and Kazvin, placing part of the conquered territory under a Georgian protectorate. This was the maximum territorial extent of Georgia throughout her history. Queen Tamar was addressed as the Queen of Abkhazians, Kartvels, Arans, Kakhs and Armenians, Shirvan Shahine and Shahin Shahine, the sovereign of East and West. Georgian historians often refer to her as Queen Tamar the Great. The period between the early 12th and the early 13th centuries, and especially the era of Tamar the Great, can truly be considered the golden age of the Kingdom of Georgia. Beside the political and military achievements, it was marked by the development of Georgian culture, including architecture, literature, philosophy and sciences. Jacques de Vitry, the Patriarch of Jerusalem at that time, wrote, "There is also in the East another Christian people, who are very warlike and valiant in battle, being strong in body and powerful in the countless numbers of their warriors. Being entirely surrounded by infidel nations, these men are called Georgians, because they especially revere and worship Saint George. Whenever they come on pilgrimage to the Lord's sepulchre, they march into the holy city without paying tribute to anyone, for the Saracens dare in no wise molest them." The Mongol invasion and the decline of the Georgian kingdom. In 1225, Jalaleddin Minburnu, the ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire, attacked Georgia, defeating its forces in the Battle of Garni, and conquered Tbilisi, after which, allegedly, 100,000 citizens were put to death for not renouncing Christianity. In the 1220s, the South Caucasus and Asia Minor faced the invasion of the Mongols. In spite of fierce resistance by Georgian Armenian forces and their allies, the whole area, including most of Georgia, all Armenian lands and central Anatolia, eventually fell to the Mongols in 1236. In 1243, Queen Rusudan of Georgia signed a peace treaty with the Mongols, in accordance with which Georgia lost her clan states, ceded western Shirvan, Nakhichevan and some other territories, and agreed to pay tribute to the Mongols, as well as to let them occupy and de facto rule more than half of the remaining territory. Although Mongol-occupied Tbilisi remained the official capital of the kingdom, the queen refused to return there and stayed in Kutaisi until her death in 1245. In addition to all the above hardships, even the kingdom of Western Georgia, the part of the kingdom that remained free from the Mongols, started disintegrating. The crown started losing control over the warlords of Samtskhe, the southern provinces of Georgia, who established their own relations with the Mongols and by the year 1266 practically seceded from the kingdom. The period between 1259 and 1330 was marked by the struggle of the Georgians against the Mongol Ilkhanate for full independence. The first anti-Mongol uprising started in 1259 under the leadership of King David Narin, who in fact waged his war for almost 30 years. The anti-Mongol strife went on under the kings Demetrius II and David VIII. Finally, it was King George the Brilliant who managed to play on the decline of the Ilkhanate, stopped paying tribute to the Mongols, restored the pre-1220 state borders of Georgia and returned the Empire of Trebizond into Georgia's sphere of influence. In 1386 to 1403, the Kingdom of Georgia faced 8 Turco-Mongolic invasions under the leadership of Tamerlane. Except in Abkhazia and Svaneti, the invasions devastated Georgia's economy, population and urban centers. The early states to emerge in the Caucasus were the Urartu Kingdom, followed by the Kolkhian, the Ariatian Kingdom and the Iberian Kingdom. In the 2nd century BC, 2 important states were formed, Caucasian Albania and Greater Armenia. In the 1st millennium AD, the Caucasus became the center of a struggle between Byzantium and Sassanid Persia. The feudal system became fully established during this time, with Christianity becoming widespread throughout the Caucasus. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Arabs conquered Transcaucasia. Later, conquests by the Seljuk Turks and the Byzantines were to follow. This situation was to lead to the establishment of large states in Armenia by the Bagratids, and in Georgia centered around the Tao-Klarjeti Principality. It was during the 12th and the 13th centuries that Georgia began to increase in strength. However, in the latter part of the 13th century, the Caucasus was subjected to invasion by the Mongol Tatars. In the 15th century, Turkic states were established in Azerbaijan. The northern Caucasus were to remain under the authority of the Mongol Tatars for a considerable period of time, which was to result in a significant degree of underdevelopment in the region and the maintenance of the patriarchal feudal system until the 19th century. In the 16th century, Georgia and Armenia were to become the objects of a fierce struggle between Persia and Turkey. Whilst the Persians were establishing the rule over eastern Georgia, the Turks dominated Imereti, Mingrelia, Guria and Ajaria in western Georgia. Without annexing these areas, the Turks maintained a lease suzerainty over them. It was not until the 16th century that Russian settlements began to appear in the northern Caucasus. Following the fall of the Astrakhan Khanate in 1556, Russia advanced her southern frontier to the Terek River. In the early 18th century, Russian Tsarism, seeking to strengthen its strategic position on the southern frontiers and to occupy the trade routes to Central Asia and the Middle East, maintained a colonial policy in the Caucasus. As a result of the Persian campaign of 1722-1723, Russian forces occupied the whole western coast of the Caspian Sea, as well as Derbent and Baku. However, because of problems in Russo-Turkish relations, the Russians concluded an alliance with the Persians through the treaties of Resht 1732 and Ganja 1735, and restored the Caspian littoral provinces to Persia. As a consequence, the southern borders of Russia reverted back to the river Terek, where the fortresses of Kizlyar and Mozdok were built, marking the beginning of the Caucasian fortified lines. Between 1768 and 1780, the Azov-Kozdok defensive line, which passed through Stavropol, became established. As a result of the Treaty of Georgievsk in 1783 between Russia and the Kartli-Kakhetian Kingdom of Eastern Georgia, a Russian protectorate was established to oppose the Turkish threat. In 1783, the construction of the Georgian military road and the fortress of Vladikavkaz of 1784 commenced. During this period, Georgia was to suffer from raids by marauding Muslim tribesmen, like the Lezgins from Dagestan. Through the various local wars and action by Muslim tribesmen, it had been estimated that the Georgian population was reduced by a half. By 1800, the combined population of eastern and western Georgia has sunk to less than 500,000 men. This state of affairs also had a paralyzing effect on the economic and industrial development of the country. The enterprise of starting an iron foundry at Borchalin had to be discontinued because of continuous raids by the Lezgin. Merchant caravans were frequently subjected to robbery by Muslim tribesmen. The deteriorating economic situation was further affected adversely by hostility between the Armenian moneyed class and the impoverished Georgian aristocracy. It should also be noted that the only line of direct communication between Russia and Georgia was the precarious military road over the Great Caucasus Range via the Daryal Pass, a route infested by hostile tribes. Moreover, the Turks and their allies, the Muslim tribesmen of Cherkessia and Dagestan, were still entrenched in a large number of areas in the North Caucasus. The effect of the advance of the Caucasian fortified line southward was to strain relations with the peoples of the Kuban area, Kabarda and Chechnya. In 1778, the Nogai and Kabardin rebellions were crushed. In 1785, the Tsarist expansion provoked a movement of the Chechen mountain people under a Muslim priest, Sheikh Mansur, against Russia. The Russian routed the forces of the Turks under Batal Pasha, which had entered Kabarda, and the Cherkess forces of Sheikh Mansur. At the Peace of Jassy in 1791, Turkey recognized the independence of Georgia and the tribes beyond the Kuban River. It was between 1792 and 1798 that the Black Sea and Kuban cordon lines were created along the Kuban River. Tsarist colonial policy was to lead to further bloodshed in the 19th century with the Caucasian War of 1817-1864. The invasion of Georgia in 1795 by the Persian troops of Aga Muhammad Khan and the destruction of Tbilisi was the catalyst for Russia to undertake the Persian campaign of 1796. Russian troops entered Georgia and occupied Derbent, Kuba and Baku in the south. However, following the accession of the throne of Pavel I, all Russian forces were withdrawn except 2 battalions which remained in Tbilisi. Eastern Georgia's attempt to find in Russia a protector against Turkish and Persian aggression led to that area's voluntary affiliation or annexation to Russia in 1801. This included the northern areas of eastern Armenia, the Pambak, Shamshadil, Borchalin and Kazakh Distantsii, temporary military districts, and the Lori district. Thus, the Georgian province was to become the first Russian administrative territory in the Transcaucasus. During the first 2 years of Russian rule, the internal situation in eastern Georgia was far from satisfactory. Russian authority was confined to the immediate area around Tiflis or Tbilisi. This restricted area was surrounded by Persian Khans, Turkish pashas and wild Muslim mountain men who were in the main hostile towards the Russians. Static Russian garrison troops were no match for the highly mobile Lezgin marauders. The only supply train from Russia through the Daryal Pass was subjected equally severely to pillage and disruption by the Ossetians. The Russian supply train was completely disrupted by a mass rebellion of Ossetian mountain men, the Kivsurs, Ntuils and other mountain peoples along the whole passage of the Georgian military road in the Great Caucasus as a result of Russian cruelty and use of slave labor on the road in the autumn of 1804. Nevertheless, the beginning of 1804 saw the liberation of Ganja from the Persian Khan, Javad by the Russians. The town was renamed Elisavetopol, Kirovabad. In the meantime, the Russians maintained their pressure on the Turks in western Georgia. By 1811, the Russians had taken Poti, Sukhumi in Abkhazia and Alkahaki from the Turks, besides crushing a rebellion of the Imereti. No sooner was western Georgia outwardly pacified than troubles erupted in eastern Georgia with rebellions by the Kartli and the Kakheti, initiated by the Persian successes against the Russians in the Karabakh region. Exhaustion of the three protagonists, Russia, Persia and Turkey, was to finally lead to a peace through one of short standing. Peace already agreed between Russia and Ottoman Empire at the Treaty of Bucharest in 1812 led to the return of Poti and Alkahakli to the Turks. Under the terms of the Treaty of Gulistan, concluded between Russia and Persia, Russia was confirmed in possession of eastern and western Georgia, Dagestan and the Kuslim Khanates of Karabakh, Ganja, Shekl, Shirvan, Derbent, Baku and Kuba. However, Tsarist colonial policy was to lead to the Caucasian War of 1817 to 1864, as a result of the annexation of eastern Georgia of 1801 and the conquest of western Georgia and Azerbaijan in 1803-1813, Russian troops stationed there now were cut off from Russia by the lands of the Chechen and those of the wild tribes in Gorny Dagestan and the Cherkess in the northwestern Caucasus. The Caucasian War of 1817-1864. The military operations in the Caucasian War involved Tsarist Russia's annexation of Western Caucasus. Chechnya, Gorny Dagestan, although juridically Dagestan had been annexed in 1813, where the Cherkess had their home. These lands were inhabited by warlike mountain peoples who constantly raided the Caucasian fortified line. After the Napoleonic Wars, Russia was able to move from mere punitive expeditions to undertake a regular advance into the heart of Chechnya and Dagestan by surrounding the mountainous region with a solid ring of fortresses. Other methods included the cutting of trails through the mountain forests, building roads and razing unruly auls, or mountain villages, to the ground. This in turn had the effect of forcing the population to either settle on the plains under the surveillance of Russian garrisons or to retreat deep into the mountains. In 1817-1818, the left flank of the Caucasian line was transferred from the Terek to the Sunja river, with the established Pregradny Stan fortress in the middle course of the Sunja. This marked the first step in the regular advance into the territory of the mountain peoples and in effect marked the beginning of the Caucasian War. The year 1818 saw the establishment of the fortress at Grozny on the lower reaches of the Sunja river. The fortresses of Внезапная 1819 and Burnaya 1821 further extended the Sunja line. In 1818, several Dagestan tribes formed an alliance and opened a campaign against the Sunja line but were repulsed. Between 1822 and 1826, several punitive expeditions were launched against the Cherkess in the region beyond the Kuban. Both the Persians and the Turks took advantage of the anti-colonial movement in the Caucasus, but after the Russo-Persian War of 1825-28, Russia annexed the Nakhichevan and Erevan Khanates. After the Russo-Turkish War of 1828 to 1829, the entire Black Sea coast from the mouth of the Kuban River to the northern border of Adjaria, including the fortresses of Ahal-Sihe and Ahal-Kahaki, came under Russian control. These actions led to the subjugation by the Russians of almost the whole of Dagestan, Chechnya and the area beyond the Kuban in the northwest. In March 1827, the Russian military policy underwent a reversion with a change from the regular advance and consolidation of all occupied territories to one of individual punitive raids and expeditions. However, The Lezgin line was completed in 1830, and the construction of the Sukhumi military road had led previously to the annexation of the Karachay region in 1828. The increasing scale of colonization in the northern Caucasus and the cruel methods of conquest pursued by Russian Tsarism were to cause large-scale spontaneous uprisings by the independent mountain peoples. The first of these rebellions took place in Chechnya in July 1825, when the mountain people headed by Beybulat captured the Androzhurt outpost. Their attempts to take Gerzel and Grozny failed, and the uprising was suppressed in 1826. This was followed in 1828, when a movement of mountain peoples arose in Chechnya and Dagestan under the religious banner of Muridism, which included among its dogmas the Gazavat, or holy war against the infidels, that is, against Christian Russians. The movement of the mountain people combined the liberation struggle against the Tsar's colonial expansion with a fight against feudal chieftains. The movement of the mountain peoples under the banner of Muridism widened the scale of conflict in the Caucasian War, although several peoples of the northern Caucasus and Dagestan, such as the Kulyuks, Ossetians, Ingush and Kabardins, remained aloof from this. There were several reasons for this. First, Muridism did not appeal to some peoples, either because they had become and remained Christians, like some of the Ossetians, or because Islam had no deep roots amongst them, like among the Kabardins. Secondly, Tsarism followed the course of carrot and stick, or divide and rule policies, which were to win over some influential tribal leaders, for instance the stand of the Avar Khan, who refused to rise up against the Russians and respond to the call of Gaza Muhammad in 1830 for a unified Chechnya and Dagestan. The gradual conquest by the Russians of the northern Caucasus slowly but surely began to take effect with the establishment of fortresses in the northwest and the creation of the Lava Line in 1839. However, some of the fortresses were to be captured the following year by the Cherkess in 1840. Perhaps the most turbulent areas for the Russian colonialists were Chechnya and Dagestan, which were continually waging rebellion under the third Imam, Shamil. However, by the spring of 1853, the Russians succeeded in forcing him out of Chechnya into Gorny Dagestan, and secondly in the northwest Caucasus, following the establishment of the Urup line. They defeated Shamil's regent, who was leading an uprising of the Cherkess. In 1853, at the eve of the Crimean War, Shamil, counting on assistance from the British and Turks, stepped up his actions against the Lezgin line at Zakatli. However, the Turkish troops were defeated at Bayshakdar in November 1853, and the attempts by the Cherkess to take the Black Sea and Lava lines were repulsed. The defeat of the Turkish army in 1854 and 1855 finally dashed Shamil's hopes for outside help. In 1858, a rebellion broke out against his rule by his own supporters in Chechnya, in the area of Vedenno. The operations of the Tsarist command were greatly facilitated in the northwest Caucasus by the disunity between the Abkhazian and Cherkess tribes. In 1855, the land of the Cherkess was cut by the Belaya River line with the establishment of the fortress of Maykop. The Abkhazians and Cherkess, forced to the sea or driven into the mountains, were compelled to resettle in the plains, or under the influence of Muslim clergy to emigrate to Turkey. In 1864, Russian administration was established in Abkhazia. On the 21st of May 1864, Russian troops captured the last center of Cherkess resistance. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878 saw Russia make substantial territorial gains with the recovery of former Georgian lands from the Ottoman Turks. In the previous wars with both Persia and Turkey, Russia had always been forced, through great power politics, to hand back land conquered by her troops in subsequent peace settlements. The Congress of Berlin confirmed Russia in her possession of extensive tracts of land from the Turks, namely Adjaria with the port of Batumi, Shavsheti, Klarjeti, Kola Ardahan and the northern portion of Tao, together with the acquisition of Kars and Aradan controlling the approaches to Turkish Anatolia. Although Russian domination brought many changes to Transcaucasia, a large part of the population never became reconciled to Russian rule. Even after pacification, a Russian euphemism for subjugation, uprisings were to continue not only amongst the Muslim communities but also by Georgian Christians. Traditions of long-standing independence, together with the ancient ties with the East, religious and cultural differences, conspired to make Transcaucasia a foreign and alien land within the Russian Empire. There was no political or nationalistic party within Georgia that could compare with the cohesion and size of the Dashnaks in Armenia. For instance, over 20% of Armenians were city dwellers. Less than 10% of Georgians lived in cities. The Armenians had a thriving bourgeoisie, which was double that of Georgia. On the question of the nobility, the Armenian nobility consisted of only 1%. In Georgia, nobility accounted for over 5% of the general population. Armenian society was predominantly peasant and merchant. Georgian society was almost entirely feudal. It is of great interest to note that since the annexation to Russia, a large proportion of the Georgian nobility had steadily lost their lands and wealth, becoming Russianized and losing their Georgian national character. Others remained on their estates and brooded. It was within the latter group that Georgian nationalism was preserved and cultivated. But, sad to say, the nobility had little sway with the peasant masses. The less affluent members of the nobility entered the professions when Georgians had as great a percentage as doctors, lawyers, school teachers and clerks as Armenia. They were not attracted to nationalism, but to socialism, where they formed the core of the Transcaucasian contingent of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. In the 1860s, Russia started to build the Transcaucasian Railway, with service between Poti and Tbilisi being inaugurated in 1872, and in 1883 the trunk line between Batumi, Tbilisi, Baku was completed. The completion of the Transcaucasian rail network was accomplished in the 1890s. The economic development of the entire region and the demands of the nascent Baku oil fields were the catalysts for this. It was in the railway yards of Tiflis or Tbilisi and the oil fields of Baku that the Transcaucasian proletariat was born. It is possible to take the view that Georgia was experiencing a number of revolutions at once. First and foremost was the struggle for the maintenance of Georgia as an independent nation. The closing stages of the 19th century saw this as a war which was alive yet confined within the Georgian heartlands, as opposed to one of physical rebellion with weapons. The second factor was the liberal dream for freedom of expression in speech and the press, the dignity and rights of the individual as a counter to Tsarist oppression. The third factor was the socialist revolution of a small concentrated proletariat in the railway workshops and a few other industries. Georgian socialism, reflecting these three trends, tacitly assumed that a socialist revolution in Russia would solve the national question by according to Georgia the right to have an autonomous national development. But to Georgian socialists, the nub of the issue was that socialism and the way offered by socialism was the guarantor of the realization of their national aspirations. It was the second factor in Georgian socialism, the liberal dream for freedoms, which made Georgian socialists Menshevik rather than Bolshevik. Under the leadership of the revolutionary Social Democrats, Georgian proletariat began a mass political struggle. During 1900-1902, there were large strikes at various industrial enterprises in Tbilisi, Batumi and the Chatura mines. This movement gained momentum in Georgia during the Russian Revolution of 1905-1907, starting with a strike of railway workers which escalated into a general strike. By the end of 1905, almost the whole of western Georgia and a large proportion of eastern Georgia were in the hands of insurgents. Needless to say, these rebellions were put down with great ruthlessness. From 1912 onwards into the Great War of 1914-1918, strike was followed by strike. During the period of the February bourgeois democratic revolution of 1917 in Russia, Soviets of deputies from the working people, soldiers and peasants were formed in early March in Tbilisi and other Georgian cities. However, these positions were mainly taken by the Mensheviks. The Special Transcaucasian Committee was established in Tbilisi on the 9th of March 1917. Revolution, World War, Civil War and armed intervention. During the First World War, the Caucasus was to become a theater of military operations. The Caucasian Front was formed against the German-Turkish alliance of 1914. The troops of the Caucasian Front repelled the Turkish offensive and in 1915 and 1916 inflicted a series of major defeats on them. Against the background of the World War, the internal problems of Russia were to finally surface, breaking into civil war. Menshevik against Bolshevik, the Red Army against the White Russian armies, the Bielobanditi or White Bandits. As a final last layer of conflict intervention was also to come from outside, with German, British and French troops becoming involved. However, the stresses of the war precipitated the collapse of Tsarist rule in March 1917. The March Revolution was to bring to the forefront in Georgia all the old social and economic problems that Tsarism had failed to address, namely the problems of availability of agricultural land and the position of the Georgian Orthodox Church. The fall of Tsarism led to the collapse of the old Tsarist police and gendarmerie, with the consequence that many regions of Georgia became hotbeds of anarchy and unrest, particularly after the final throes of the October Revolution. As well as universal unrest, Georgia and Transcaucasia were to suffer acute food shortages due to the state of anarchy prevailing in Russia. At this time, Enver Pasha's government of Young Turks was well aware of the excellent opportunity that Russian disarray had provided to recover the lands lost by Turkey over the previous century, and subsequently, in February 1918, Turkish forces advanced on Erzurum and Trabzon. There was the prospect of the vast number of Turks and Tatars living in the Caucasus rising and supporting their victorious Muslim brethren. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on the 3rd of March 1918, amongst other matters, agreed that Russian territory would no longer include the areas of Batumi, Aradan and Kars. After a mere 2 months, the Turks captured the great fortress of Kars and occupied Batumi, helped by the Muslim Georgians, the Laz and the Ajars. Food shortages were producing famine in many regions of Transcaucasia. The oil port of Baku was a Bolshevik stronghold in an otherwise Menshevik Transcaucasia. Having obtained the territory that they coveted, the Turks renewed their peace overtures. At Batumi in May 1918, the Turks pressed demands, with the threat of invasion, for the cession of the Georgian regions of Akhaltsikhe and Akhalkhaki and the Armenian lands around Alexandropol. Following Turkish ultimatums, German help was solicited, and on the 4th of June 1918, Turkish territorial demands were satisfied without invasion. However, some 10 days beforehand, Georgia had proclaimed itself a sovereign country on the 26th of May 1918, independent of the Transcaucasian Republic. The Democratic Republic of Georgia, 1918-1921. The Russian Revolution of October 1917 plunged the whole empire into a bloody civil war, during which several outlying Russian territories declared independence. Georgia was one of these, proclaiming the establishment of the independent Democratic Republic of Georgia on May 26, 1918. The new country was ruled by the Menshevik faction of the Social Democratic Party, which established a multi-party system in sharp contrast with the dictatorship of the proletariat established by the Bolsheviks in Russia. It was recognized by Soviet Russia in the Treaty of Moscow of 1920 and the major Western powers in 1921. During the final stages of the World War I, the Armenians and Georgians had been defending against the advance of the Ottoman Empire. In June 1918, in order to forestall an Ottoman advance on Tiflis or Tbilisi, Georgian troops controlled the Lori provinces, which had an overwhelming Armenian population. After the armistice of Mudrus and the withdrawal of the Ottomans, the Georgian forces remained. Georgian Menshevik parliamentarian Irakli Tsereteli offered the Armenians would be safer from the Turks as Georgian citizens. The Georgians offered a quadripartite conference including Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan and the mountainous Republic of Northern Caucasus in order to resolve the issue, which the Armenians rejected. In December 1918, the Georgians were confronting a rebellion chiefly in the village of Uzunlar in the Lori region. Within days, hostilities commenced between the two republics. The Georgian-Armenian War was a border war fought in 1918 between the Democratic Republic of Georgia and the Democratic Republic of Armenia over the parts of then disputed provinces of Lori, Yavakheti, but largely populated by Armenians. In February 1921, the Red Army of the Soviet Russia invaded Georgia and after a short war occupied the whole country. The Georgian government was forced to flee in exile. Guerrilla resistance in 1921-1924 was followed by a large-scale patriotic uprising in August 1924. Colonel Kahutsa Chulukashvili was one of the most prominent guerrilla leaders in this phase. Soviet rule, 1921-1990. In 1922, When the Soviet Union was formally formed, Georgia was forcibly incorporated into the Trans-Caucasian SFSR, comprising Armenia, Azerbaijan and Georgia, including Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The Soviet government forced Georgia to cede several areas to Turkey, the province of Taoklarjeti and part of Batumi province, Azerbaijan, the province of Hereti or Saingilo, to Armenia, the Lori region, and to Russia, northeastern corner of Hevi, eastern Georgia. Georgia was spared the worst excesses of collectivization which started in 1930. The rate of collectivization was also slowly reaching 75% only in 1937. Meanwhile, forced collectivization led to mass hunger and an enormous death rate in Ukraine. Soviet rule was harsh. About 40,000 people were lost to the collectivization and the purges under Stalin and his secret police chief, the Georgian Lavrenti Beria. In 1936, the Transcaucasian Soviet Republic was dissolved and Georgia became the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic within the Soviet Union. Reaching the Caucasus oil fields became one of the main objectives of Adolf Hitler's invasion in the USSR in June 1941, but the armies of the Axis powers did not get as far as Georgia. The country contributed almost 550,000 fighters, of whom 300,000 were killed by the Germans, and it was a vital source of textiles, munitions and oil to the Soviet war effort. However, a number of Georgians fought on the side of the German armed forces, forming the Georgian Legion of the Wehrmacht. During this period, Stalin ordered the deportation of the Chechen, Ingush, Karachay and the Balkarian peoples from the northern Caucasus. They were transported to Siberia and Central Asia for alleged collaboration with the Nazis. Stalin abolished their respective autonomous republics. The Georgian Soviet Republic was briefly granted some of their territory until 1957. Stalin's successful appeal for patriotic unity eclipsed Georgian nationalism during the Second World War and diffused it in the years following. On March 9, 1956, about 100 Georgians were killed when they demonstrated against Nikita Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization. The decentralization program introduced by Khrushchev in the mid-1950s was soon exploited by Georgian Communist Party officials to build their own regional power base. A thriving pseudo-capitalist shadow economy emerged alongside the official state-owned economy. While the official growth rate of the economy of Georgia was among the lowest in the USSR, such indicators as savings level, rates of car and house ownership were the highest in the Soviet Union, making Georgia one of the most economically successful Soviet republics. Corruption was at a high level. Among all of the Union republics, Georgia had the highest number of residents with high or special secondary education. Although corruption was hardly unknown in the Soviet Union, it became so widespread and blatant in Georgia that it came to be an embarrassment to the authorities in Moscow. Eduard Shevardnadze, the country's interior minister between 1964 and 1972, gained a reputation as a fighter of corruption and engineered the removal of Vasil Mzavanadze, the corrupt first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party. Eduard Shevardnadze ascended to the position of first secretary with the blessing of Moscow. He was an effective and able ruler of Georgia from 1972 to 1985, improving the official economy and dismissing hundreds of corrupt officials. Soviet power and Georgian nationalism clashed in 1978, when Moscow ordered revision of the constitutional status of the Georgian language as Georgia's official state language. Bowing to pressure from mass street demonstrations on April 14, 1978, Moscow approved Shevardnadze's reinstatement of the constitutional guarantee the same year. April 14th was established as a day of the Georgian language. Eduard Shevardnadze's appointment as Soviet foreign minister in 1985 brought his replacement in Georgia by Jumber Patiashvili, a conservative and generally ineffective communist who coped poorly with the challenges of the perestroika times. Towards the end of the late 1980s, increasingly violent clashes occurred between communist authorities, the resurgent Georgian nationalist movement, and the nationalist movement in Georgia's minority-populated regions, notably in South Ossetia. On April 9, 1989, Soviet troops were used to break up a peaceful demonstration at the government building in Tbilisi. 20 Georgians were killed, hundreds were wounded and poisoned. The event radicalized Georgian politics, prompting many, even some Georgian communists, to conclude that independence was preferable to the continuation of Soviet rule. Independent Georgia. All of the post-Soviet countries have signed a series of treaties and agreements to settle the legacy of the former Soviet Union multilaterally and bilaterally in the absence of Georgia's representatives. However, in 1993, Georgia joined the Commonwealth of Independent States, signing the Belovezha Accords, the CIS Charter and other agreements. Georgia withdrew from the CIS in 2019. Opposition pressure on the communist government was manifested in popular demonstrations and strikes, which ultimately resulted in an open, multi-party and democratic parliamentary election being held on 28 October 1990, in which the Round Table, Free Georgia Bloc, captured 54% of the proportional vote to gain 155 seats out of the 250 up for election, while the Communists gained 64 seats and 30% of the proportional vote. This election was the first open multi-party election in the Soviet Union. The leading dissidents, Zviad Gamsakhourdia, became the head of the Supreme Council of the Republic of Georgia. On March 31, 1991, Gamsakhourdia wasted no time in organizing a referendum on independence, which was approved by 98.9% of the votes. Formal independence from the Soviet Union was declared on April 9, 1991, although it took some time before it was widely recognized by outside powers such as the United States and European countries. Gamsakhourdia's government strongly opposed any vestiges of Russian dominance, such as the remaining Soviet military bases in the Republic, and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, his government declined to join the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gamsakhourdia was elected president on May 26, 1991, with 86% of the vote. He was subsequently accused by his opponents of an erratic and authoritarian style of government, with nationalists and reformists joining forces in an uneasy anti-Gamsakhourdia coalition. A tense situation was worsened by the large amount of ex-Soviet weaponry available to the quarreling parties and by the growing power of paramilitary groups. The situation came to a head on December 22, 1991, when armed opposition groups launched a violent military coup d'etat, besieging Gamsakhourdia and his supporters in the government buildings of central Tbilisi. Gamsakhourdia managed to evade his enemies and fled to the breakaway Russian Republic of Chechnya in January 1992. A new government invited Eduard Shevardnadze to become the head of a state council, in effect a president, in March 1992, following Gamsakhourdia's ouster. In August 1992, a separatist dispute in the Georgian Autonomous Republic of Abkhazia escalated when government forces and paramilitaries were sent into the area to quell separatist activities. The Abkhazians fought back with the help from paramilitaries from Russia's North Caucasus region and alleged covert support from the Russian military stationed in a base in Geldauta, Abkhazia. And in September 1993, the government forces suffered a catastrophic defeat, which led to them being driven out and the entire Georgian population of the region being expelled. Around 14,000 people died, another 300,000 were forced to flee. Actually, Abkhazia became one of those post-Soviet Russian-controlled territories which would later serve as bases for something like a Russian reconquest. Ethnic violence also flared in South Ossetia, but was eventually quelled, although at the cost of several hundred casualties and 100,000 refugees fleeing into Russian North Ossetia. In southwestern Georgia, the Autonomous Republic of Adjara came under the control of Aslan Abashidze, who managed to rule his republic from 1991 to 2004 as a personal fief in which the Tbilisi government had little influence. On September 24, 1993, in the wake of the Abkhaz disaster, Zviad Gamsakhourdia returned from exile to organize an uprising against the government. His supporters were able to capitalize on the disarray of the government forces and quickly overran much of western Georgia. This alarmed Russia, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and units of the Russian army were sent into Georgia to assist the government. Gamsakhourdia's rebellion quickly collapsed and he died on December 31, 1993, apparently after being cornered by his enemies. In a highly controversial agreement, Shevardnadze's government agreed that it would join the CIS as a part of the price for military and political support. Eduard Shevardnadze narrowly survived a bomb attack in August 1995 that he blamed on his erstwhile paramilitary allies. He took the opportunity to imprison the paramilitary leader Yaba Yusseliani and ban his Mkhedrioni militia in what was proclaimed as a strike against mafia forces. However, his government and his own family became increasingly associated with pervasive corruption that hampered Georgia's economic growth. Shevardnadze won the presidential elections in November 1995 and April 2000 with large majority, but there were persistent allegations of vote rigging. The Russian wars in Chechnya caused considerable friction with Russia, which accused Georgia of harboring Chechen guerrillas. Further friction was caused by Shevardnadze's close relationship with the United States, which saw him as a counterbalance to Russian influence in the strategic Trans-Caucasus region. Georgia became a major recipient of US foreign and military aid, signed a strategic partnership with NATO, and declared an ambition to join both NATO and the EU. In 2002, the United States sent hundreds of special operation forces to train the military of Georgia, a program known as the Georgia Train and Equip program. Perhaps most significantly, the country secured a $3 billion project for a Caspian-Mediterranean pipeline, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan. A powerful coalition of reformists, headed by Mikhail Saakashvili and Zurab Skhvania, united to oppose Shevardnadze's government in the November 2, 2003 parliamentary elections. The elections were widely regarded as blatantly rigged, including by OSCE observers. In response, the opposition organized massive demonstrations in the streets of Tbilisi. After 2 tense weeks, Shevardnadze resigned on November 23, 2003 and was replaced as president on an interim basis by Burjanadze. These results were annulled by the Georgia Supreme Court after the Rose Revolution on November 25, 2003, following allegation of widespread electoral fraud and large public protests, which led to the resignation of Shevardnadze. Later, Georgia became even more famous or infamous by the 2008 August attack of Russia against the country. The nation was on its way to join the European Union when Russian forces took the province of South Ossetia from Georgia. This effectively stopped the negotiations with the European Union and laid a further way of acting of Russian government and forces against other countries like Ukraine. Thanks for listening and watching. This is the History and Mythology channel. Please share, like and support us.